information you can't have yet.
What is your shirt? What's on your shirt? What's on your shirt? Okay. Never heard of him. Actually, we share a birthday. Same as John Lennon's. And Jackson Brown, for that matter.
20 seconds. I'm going to look it up. Wait. October 9th. Not October 9th. Jackson Brown. It's a Tuesday.
On a Tuesday?
Uh-oh. Birthday party for Rick.
God.
Right there. For your birthday, we'll get you one. It may not be the gender you prefer.
I know your birthday, Red.
That's nice. I know yours, too.
Yeah.
Do you know the year he was born, Gator?
Yep.
Andrew, you did.
Okay.
He actually had a stroke last night.
I may have.
I'm kidding, right?
All right, we talked about external respiration. We talked about gas transport. Now we're going to talk about internal. We're going to talk about the gas transport part of it. Oxygen, remember, is carried two ways. Dissolved in the plasma, attached to hemoglobin. The total amount being called the oxygen content. Any questions? That sums it up, right? We know that there's minuscule amount as dissolved. Primarily, it's attached to hemoglobin, but that diffused, because there's a partial pressure difference in oxygen between the alveolus and the capillary, gas then will diffuse across. We know about the solubility. The actual amount that is carried as dissolved is an extremely small amount, but it's necessary because it's going to drive what the saturation is. And it's a linear relationship that you end up having between the partial pressure and the amount that is actually dissolved in as an oxygen content. This is talking about the driving pressure. Where is the lowest PO2 in the body? In the feet? Did you just say that?
Well, if you're standing up. This is being recorded, right, Rick?
Oh, it's being recorded, all right. That was Dana.
I wasn't being serious. See you guys all later.
Where in the body do you think it is? Lower than that. It's actually about 1 millimeter mercury. Mitochondria. By the time it diffuses into the cells, reach its maximum distance that it's going to need to travel. And it's just absorbed by that point in time. I don't know. PaO2 again doesn't tell us. It just tells us about that driving pressure, which is necessary. The partial pressure is determined not only by the alveolar air equation, so things like carbon dioxide is going to affect it, things like barometric pressure, FiO2. It's also determined by any VQ abnormalities that might be present, both on the ventilation and on the perfusion side. And it talks about the diffusibility of the alveolar capillary membrane. And again, think about your causes of hypoxemia that you end up having. By now, you should be able to just live them. Unfortunately, the dissolved amount of oxygen is insufficient for life. You need to have something more than 0.3 volumes percent going around. We need some substance to carry it, and voila, we have hemoglobin. And the beauty of it is that if you remember back to the CO2 transport, that you end up having hemoglobin being a buffer of excess hydrogen ions. This guy, on the other hand, has no hemoglobin. Lives in Antarctic waters where the temperature is just barely above freezing, and he's able to survive with no hemoglobin, which is, he actually does produce proteins that are like antifreeze to keep the blood from freezing off. Just thought I'd throw that in there, just for fun. We know the hemoglobin is composed of two components, a heme group and a globulin chain. The heme group is obviously where the iron in the ferrous state is. Globulin, on the other hand, there's two chains, an alpha and a beta chain. It's a huge molecule as far as its gram molecular weight. And one heme group binds with one of the amino acid chains in a reversible fashion. So we can see our alpha and our beta chains, and then the little green heme units are where they're attached. Normal hemoglobin, we're going to go ahead and just use the easy method there, 15 plus or minus 2 for men, 14 plus or minus 2 for females. The hemoglobin molecule resides in the erythrocyte. We know that. That's what gives it the red color. There's bunches of different variants of hemoglobin. The one we typically look at is hemoglobin A, but there are some others that are out there, hemoglobin Kansas, hemoglobin, or fetal hemoglobin, sulfhemoglobin. When you have an oxygen molecule that binds with one of the iron units, the hemoglobin molecule actually unfolds to allow those other three sites to be bound. So you either have a hemoglobin molecule that has completely attached with oxygen, or there's no oxygen attached and it's reduced. We know that each gram of hemoglobin combines with 1.34 milliliters of oxygen. That's how we derive our oxygen content. And again, the saturationist talks about how much is saturated, not how much hemoglobin is present. So you can be profoundly anemic and have 100% saturation. This is that all or no phenomenon. You can see this guy over here is without oxygen. He's lonely. So we talked about the total sites available, the sites filled. That tells us what our saturation is. That's how it's derived. You can see the various ones there. We know that it's not a linear relationship like partial pressure is. On the other hand, the PO2 and the SO2 have a sigmoidal-shaped curve. We know the rough plotting of it we could derive by simply looking at the PO2 of venous blood, where the steep part is. And what do we call this again? The P50, the point at which you have 50% saturation. Think of it as two different lines, loading and unloading. The steep line means that I have a small change in PO2 will yield a large change in saturation. That's the dissociation portion. This is where oxygen release is maximized. So a small drop in PO2 as it leaves the capillary to go into the cell will promote hemoglobin being released, hemoglobin releasing oxygen, and that's how we can get the large amount of oxygen unloaded quickly. Because again, you only have a certain amount of time, 0.75 seconds, that it's sitting in front of a capillary, or the capillary can unload to the tissue. Minimum COPD, minimum PO2 you want to have is 60, and that's kind of that demarcation between the association and the dissociation part of the curve. And as we saw, the 50%, the saturation that yields the saturation of 50% is called the P50. It is normalized, or at least in calculations, it's normalized to a normal body temperature, normal CO2, and a normal pH. Normal value you should know is 27, and a shift in the curve to the left or to the right means that P50 has moved. If the P50 is lower than 27, we're going to call that a leftward shift, and that shows that you have an increased affinity for hemoglobin, left lung. So that's what happens at the pulmonary capillary. So for any given PO2, the saturation will be higher. Say I told you that your PO2 was 55 and your SO2 was 92. Right or left? Ever the diplomat. It's got to be to the left. For a PO2 of 55, I would expect to see something less than 90. If it's higher than that, then I know that I have a leftward shift. Rightward shift is exactly the opposite as far as what we're talking about, P50 higher than 27. And here you can end up seeing examples of that, the normal line in the middle, the blue being a rightward shift, the red being a leftward shift, and the various causes. You should be well aware of what they are. Because I could give you a blood gas like this and say, which of the following would cause that? Okay. So what's worse, a little bit of acidosis, a little bit of alkalosis? My gut tells me alkalosis is worse. Because even though you can carry more, it doesn't release it. So I'd rather have a little bit of acidosis. Well, I'd rather be normal, but then again, it's a stretch, I know. Acidosis may not be able to carry as much, but it's not a problem releasing it at the tissue level. Oh, what's that?
Why is it more difficult for an alkaline state to release that?
Because the oxygen is bound tighter to the hemoglobin. It doesn't want to release it. It's in love. Bohr Effect. Bohr Effect is CO2's effect on the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, meaning that as the CO2 level rises, pH falls, we have a rightward shift that's going to promote the release, and this is what happens at the tissues. As the capillary, or as the blood flow goes by the capillary picks up CO2. The PCO2 in capillary blood is higher, so it promotes the release of oxygen at that point. At the lungs, oxygen levels are higher than they are in the venous blood, so that's going to promote the release of CO2. The CO2 binding capacity goes down, and you end up having the Haldane effect. So Haldane is O2's effect on CO2. Bohr effect is CO2's effect on O2 carrying capacity. They kind of go hand in hand. Then there's a mysterious substance, 2,3-DPG. It's an organic phosphate, and if you want to just think of it, it has a tendency to bind with hemoglobin in a competitive fashion. So as 2,3-DPG binds to hemoglobin, there's not the ability for the oxygen to bind. So high levels of 2,3-DPG prevent the carrying of oxygen in the process. And that shift is a little more of a permanent, not permanent, wrong word, a little bit longer in duration than the other things that might cause it. Why these would increase is whenever we have a cellular hypoxia present, it's the body's response to this. Could be due to anemia. It's going to go ahead and say, I want more 2,3-DPG released. Congenital heart disease, one of the things that happens when you go to high altitudes for prolonged periods of time. And the opposite would be those to their septic shock and acidemia. And in stored blood, after about 2 weeks of storage, the DPG gets dissolved. Yes?
So the body's response to hypoxemia is to not allow more oxygen to bind.
Isn't that weird? But it also produces more hemoglobin. Erythropoietin's released, and you end up having polycythemia developing. I didn't make it up. this should be no problem to calculate. We know that the difference between arterial and venous is roughly about 5 volumes %, 20 in the arterial system, 15 in the venous system, difference of 5. That Fick equation, the same guy who, Fick's law, I believe it's the same guy. Fick equation describes a relationship between cardiac output consumption and the mixed venous, or the arterial venous difference in value. So you can indirectly calculate cardiac output if you know the arterial and venous contents and the oxygen consumption. Conversely, if you know the cardiac output and the difference, you can determine the oxygen consumption. So this is one you may want to, if you haven't stored that in your memory, you may want to. Cyanosis, again, is that bluish discoloration of the mucous membranes. It can be peripheral, meaning just in the hands, which usually implies there's a poor perfusion to that area. Raynaud syndrome is a classic example. It can also be central, where you're seeing it in the mucous membranes in the around the lips or inside the gums. It's present when 5 grams per deciliter of hemoglobin is desaturated. Usually you got to drop down to a saturation less than 85% before you end up seeing it. I will not expect you to do this calculation, thank you very much. But if you're ever curious how you would determine 5 grams of hemoglobin are desaturated, I go ahead and I take my hemoglobin times my arterial saturation, add to that the hemoglobin times the venous saturation, and divide by 2. So if I take my desaturated arterial hemoglobin, which is about 2%, multiply it by my hemoglobin of 15, add to that the 25% of venous, and do the math on there, and you can see this is a very small amount, but when that gets above 5%, cyanosis will appear. And the key part that I want you to remember with cyanosis is that anemic patients, well, I got never, but I probably should hedge my bet on that one. But rarely will they be cyanotic. They'll be just plain pale. So you can't use cyanosis as a good index. And really, if that's 85% of our patients, if we're seeing cyanosis, we're in a world of hurt. Transport then is that oxygen content times the cardiac output times 10. Should be in there. Normal is about 1,000. Since we only utilize 250, there's a huge amount of reserve that we have. And there's actually what we call oxygen extraction, which is 25% of the normal value that we end up utilizing. And again, it's not only the oxygenation indices, including the hemoglobin, but it's also the ability of the cardiac system to respond. And lastly, just want to talk about the hemoglobin abnormalities. Carboxyhemoglobin, again, has a huge affinity for hemoglobin over oxygen. It does cause a leftward shift, which is, I guess, whatever oxygen is getting onto the hemoglobin, it allows it to be carried. It is also a byproduct of normal metabolism, so you will have some small amount of carboxyhemoglobin even in a non-smoker, although in smokers it is obviously higher. Varying levels of where toxicity and lethal levels are, but roughly somewhere in that area. And this is an article that I give you reference to. I think Malley does too, but nobody ever reads Malley. But if you got a doc in the ER who insists on doing arterial punctures to get serial carbon monoxide levels, you can use venous blood just as easily. The values correlate between the two. And usually if we see carboxyhemoglobin, it's because some incomplete combustion is present. This is the season when the furnace kicking on. Are you kidding me? Yeah, it's a sad state. But if there's any damage to the furnace that happened over the summer, this is when we see a lot of times families come into the ER with carbon monoxide poisoning. And we know the treatment's 100% oxygen, reduces the half-life of carboxyhemoglobin profoundly, and hyperbaric treatment still remains controversial. I don't know why I got that slide in there. Methemoglobin is where instead of being in the ferrous state, it's in the ferric state because we've lost an electron. Again, byproduct of some metabolic processes, so there is a small amount that is in your bloodstream, although it's very, very low. Whenever you see excessive nitrate ingestion or administration, you'll end up seeing methemoglobin developing. I've never had a patient who was on a nitrite drip and drew his blood, and it wasn't red; it was literally rusty colored, and he's just like the weirdest looking thing I ever saw. Treatment's methylene blue, sulfhemoglobin, some medications, sulfonamides, which include Bactrim, etc. They can lead to the development of this abnormal hemoglobin. It really, you can't do much about it. You just got to wait for it to be destroyed. But it's a hemoglobin form that doesn't allow for oxygen transport. And then not lastly, but next to lastly, fetal hemoglobin, we know is what occurs during the latter part of pregnancy and supports the oxygen delivery because your PO2 is so low in utero. It has a P50 of about 20, so it can bind very easily at 30 weeks. Starts to convert itself. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. The marrow starts to produce hemoglobin A. It's not that the hemoglobin F turns into hemoglobin A, but the production of hemoglobin F stops and hemoglobin A begins. And they basically, by about a year, have all the fetal hemoglobin gone. And then finally, hemoglobin S, the sickle, a variant where the beta chain is altered, so it basically causes painful episodes, what we call sickle crisis. And patient appears to be anemic. You can see instead of having the nice concave disc, I have these spears, and they cause clotting and obstruction of the small capillaries, which can lead to some infections and stroke. Okay. And I'll stop there.